Hello, folks. Welcome to another fine Sunday morning. Again, Sunday morning for me. Some of you may be elsewhere. Glad to get this back going. I was feeling a little ill last week, so thanks for letting me take another week to get this for you all. But it's good to be here. And the good news is we're pretty far through the book, so hope you folks got a chance to read the chapter. I will jump straight into the live stream if there's nothing else. I think today's going to be today's definitely going to be a shorter one. So, with nothing else, say hi in the chat so I know who's around. I know Luke is around, and we will jump straight into it. So, jump into the slideshow here. Oh, it does not seem to want to work. Here we go. All right. Hey, we have Annie as well. Okay, so this week's chapter was instrumental variables. I'm curious, who got a chance to read this chapter and went through it? And who's just going through it right now? We got Luke, Annie, and Lars. So between you three, who actually read this chapter and tried the things out, and who's just sitting through the live stream fresh? Oh, Julia read it? Okay. I'm interested to get your thoughts in a second here. Annie read it, very long. Yeah, it was a very, very long chapter for sure. I think it's the longest one, so it'll be downhill from here. So we'll just do our normal deal. I think there'll be much more discussion this time, as you'll see. It's going to be a shorter live stream. You'll see again why in a second. The chapter overview, though, three things that I pulled out from this chapter, largely from the not from the headers, but from the chapter itself. Instrumental variables, obviously the most, with the chapter title, the most prominent feature, the one that we were going to talk about the most. The other one was local average treatment effects. And there was the talk about heterogeneous effects, and then the 5 assumptions, and then popular designs. And this time we're going to scroll through the chapter a whole bunch. The chapter was so big, and frankly I had a hard time organizing it into slides. So if there's anything in particular you want to talk about, I would list it in the chat now, and we can do a quick poll, see what people either want to discuss and ask questions about, or what people want to share their opinions about more. And for this chapter in particular, I should say, it was such a dense one that maybe we could end up doing a group discussion on Restream, and where multiple folks are in a session, rather than you folks just being constrained to the chat. So if you'd like to have more of a discussion environment, which I actually think would be pretty good for this chapter, we can do another one-off, and I think that would be quite fantastic. So let me know what you think about what you think about this idea. Luke says, I wasn't fully sure what was happening with the jive method. I don't even know what the jive method was. I must have forgotten. But let's do the chapter overview really quick. The most important picture clearly was this DAG. So this part was really interesting about instrumental effects, and I'm to recap it because this was the crux of this chapter. Let's say you have something of interest, like they had do family sizes affect I think it was like labor wages? Does methamphetamine availability affect foster care? Other examples were, do Medicare affect health outcomes? There were a lot of these examples through the chapter, which was really, really good. So how can we study the effects of methamphetamine on foster care and child abuse when we have a bunch of things we can't observe. And in this case, the instrument was methamphetamine drug bust. There were other examples with schooling and an arbitrary cutoff with when folks can enter school and then when they can leave school at 16. So, well, let's get in. We'll do it. The most, I don't know. A quote that stuck out for me here was, good instruments should feel weird. Honestly, this whole chapter felt pretty weird to me. Nothing wrong with the writing or anything like that, but there were so many things that I at a high level made sense, but I couldn't really wrap my head around with the details. That I feel pretty weird about instrumental variables in general, to be quite honest. So, going through the 3 sections at a high level, we had more unobserved controls. So last time we had regression discontinuity design, where the discontinuity would control for the unobserved. In this case, the instrument controls for the unobserved. We need 3 things from what I gathered from this chapter. Again, a very similar diagram. I just pulled the next dag out. You need to meet the criteria of exclusion restriction, where, if I'm going to quote this correctly, this instrument here can only affect Y through the mediating variable here, through S. It can't affect A or anything else. And if you can find something that just works through S, then you can figure out the effect on Y. So as this thing changes, it only affects S, which only changes, which then affects Y. So the next thing, as Scott pointed out, is it has to be highly correlated. So if this is weakly correlated, and they call these weak instruments, it's really tough to pull out the effect. But if it's highly correlated, then it becomes much simpler. And then you need an estimator. This was a little bit, I don't want to say it was vague, but I didn't at least catch through the chapter if there were other estimators, but the one that was brought up the most was 2-stage least squares. So there was a proof of it. I had a hard time following the proof, but logically it makes sense to me in that you would regress out the effects of everything other than Z, and then from that regression you could then regress just Z. Now I was a little bit stuck on why we couldn't just put them all into one big regression and then control that way and then get Z. It didn't quite click for me, but I will take it on faith that you need 2-stage least squares, because there were a lot of citations and whatnot for 2-stage least squares. For you folks, what did you think? How are you doing up until this point in the chapter? Did you feel like you have a strong handle on instrumental variables, that all these things made sense, that you were able to use these, like all these conditions made, getting some artifacts, all these conditions make sense to you? So Ambika asked the question, what do you mean by putting it all into one big regression? So I didn't quite click with me, honestly, why we needed the 2-stage least squares. I wonder why we couldn't just put this all into one regression and then just pull out the coefficient on Z, for instance, to find out the causal effect. We'll go through it, but I'll show an example. The lottery example had a good one, where you estimate one thing and then you use that estimate to then in another regression. If I'm explaining this poorly, it's because frankly I don't totally get it, but it was brought up enough. I apologize for the visual artifacts. Hopefully those don't happen too often, but let's continue on. So the next big thing that I pulled out of the chapter is local average treatment effects. So there was the first half of the chapter made it made a homogeneity assumption where the treatment effect would be the same across all units. And I believe the second half of the chapter, when we got to this, was when you lift that assumption of heterogeneous treatment effects, you then have to make some more assumptions. And specifically, Scott listed out 5 assumptions. I won't read the full text here, but the first 2 were, I think, pretty obvious. Well, the first 2 were the same as before. Stable unit treatment value assumption that we've had for a long time now. Independence assumption, which we also sort of, I believe, had in the past. Exclusion restriction was the new one that has to do with instrumental variables. And then correlated, we just talked about, and monotonicity, that the instrumental variable acts in the same way with everything else. Scott then brings up in the chapter that there are so many assumptions, especially in the conclusion we'll talk about. There's so many assumptions that it becomes harder, that instrumental variables seem to be less popular because it took so much burden to meet all this criteria, but then pointed out that it is a powerful design, and of course he had many case studies, and he himself has used instrumental variables in his own research. He talked about the methamphetamine case, for example, so it seems to have use. What wasn't clear is whether it has as much use as regression discontinuity design, which he shows the chart in the last chapter where that thing since 1999 has just exploded in design. So exploded in use. And then the last portion was about popular designs for instrumental variable use. There were 3, and I'm just going to list them here: lotteries, judged fixed effects, and Bartik instruments. I will go to the text and we can talk about it more there. Because I struggled so much with understanding the first part of the chapter, other than listing out these seem to be the 3 most popular things from the text itself, I had no original insight that I could list here. I was trying to write a couple slides, but I didn't feel like I would have much value add other than that. So I just want to call out that this was in the chapter, and I found this to be the most interesting part of the chapter because in those 3 designs there were applied case studies which he talked about, which was nice, but you could also see different ways that you could construct instruments. So we're already at the quote, and this is a little paraphrasing of the conclusion, but instrumental variables are a powerful design for identifying causal effects when your data has selection bias and unobservables. I think it says has many limitations, which cause many applied research to skew it. It only identifies the local average treatment effect under heterogeneous treatment effects that may or may not have policy relevant variables. Unlike RDD, which has 1 main identifying assumption, instrumental variables has up to 5. This you can see why people find IV to be less credible. It's just, like he says at the bottom, it's harder and harder to imagine a pure instrument that satisfies all 5 conditions. So this was my challenge with the chapter largely, is with the instruments that were brought up, I couldn't really figure out how they met every single criteria. A good example would be the lottery design for the Medicare example that was in the end. I get that you have a control group that doesn't get a lottery, and then a treated group that that gets a lottery, and then within the treated group, and the folks that get the lottery get the chance to enroll in Medicare due to the lottery. Some percentage of them enroll, but I completely fail to understand how that makes an instrument separate than just straight randomized control design, to be quite honest. So I got lost, and I feel like in every example I got lost in every one of the 5. So that is all I have for instrumental variables. Not as much insight as previous chapters, unfortunately, but I will go through and just answer as many questions as I can. I think at this point you're fully aware that I'm not claiming I am an expert or understand instrumental variables even well after reading this chapter, but I think there is a lot of merit in having a discussion and talking it through. Talking it through certainly helps elucidate my own thinking, so I will take a stab at it. I see Luke has asked the first question. I wasn't very clear on monotonicity. Could you expand? Yes. So let me go back to that. To my understanding of monotonicity, as in context of the chapter, in general, monotonicity means that a function is constantly going like one way. So, people's heights tend to grow over time. I guess people's heights drop as they're older, so maybe that's not a good example. But monotonicity would be like a logistic regression where the function is constantly increasing, or a linear regression where the function is constantly increasing. In certain contexts, if you know that things are monotonic, you can make a lot of assumptions that help either with the math or with the estimation. In this case, the assumption here is the instrumental variable operates weakly in the same direction as all individual units. Let me go back. So I guess the idea here would be, I'm totally making this up, and it's a little bit of a macabre example, but it's in the it's in the textbook, so I'm going to use it. Is the effect of methamphetamine availability on child abuse. And I guess the monotonicity example here would be if people that use methamphetamine stop using methamphetamine, and the example in this chapter being because prices are too high or the availability is low, that they will all stop harming their children. And a non-monotonic assumption here would be some people abuse their children more because they're more frustrated they don't have access to drugs or something like that. So maybe some people stop using drugs and become better parents, and some people stop using drugs and become worse parents. The assumption here is that everything moves one direction, and Julio has a much better example. More education doesn't reduce your salary. So if you get more and more educated, you'll always make more money. I like that example a lot more. I probably should have stuck with that one. The one in the lottery I think is a good one too. If you have more access to healthcare, that your health outcomes will become better. So you don't get access to Medicare and then suddenly have worse health when you're treated. So Luke, let me know if that answers your question about monotonicity and its meaning and context here. Lars says, and find in particular that you need good domain knowledge to find variables that meet all criteria. Yeah, Lars, Scott has brought this up a whole bunch, but in this chapter, he really seemed to just like really dive into it. So I'm gonna pull up the chapter. There was sort of like a philosophical example here. It's a kind of a funny example. I'm just gonna show it to you. It was this one about Chance the Rapper and Kanye West, to be quite honest. I'm just gonna find it. It was this one. So I think, I don't mean this in a bad way, but I think right around here is when the chapter started like falling off the rails for me. Again, not because it's a badly written chapter, but just because it's just like so perplexed. So I won't read the whole thing here, but Scott pulls out a quotes from lyrics from Chance the Rapper, and he has two lines about this rapper saying he's never gonna go to hell, and then Kanye West meeting Kanye West and never gonna fail, and then he goes into a lot of it's two stories about how Chance the Rapper is not gonna go to hell, so that makes for a good instrument, and then how Chance the Rapper is never gonna fail because he made Kanye, and why that makes for a weak instrument. And I like sort of get it, and good stories, but it didn't. I just like did not quite click to me why if Kanye West was a weak instrument and Chance the Rapper, the never gonna go to hell thing was a strong instrument. So to bring that back to why I'm talking about this, Lars had brought up it takes a lot of domain knowledge, and there is an incredible amount of assumptions made between this story and that story that makes one a strong instrument and makes one a weak instrument. So in this one, there's a whole thing about how Chance goes to visit a preacher and he converts into Christianity, and he's not going to go to hell for that reason, and that makes it a strong instrument. But in this other one about how Kanye West is a really great rapper, and if you just meet Kanye, you're going to become successful because Kanye is successful, and that makes for a weak instrument, and the first one makes for a strong instrument. And the amount of like story building that was required to make the differentiation between one or the other was a lot. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but just like the amount of world building it took, even in this theoretical example, to make the strong argument and the weak argument. I don't feel like I would be able to do that at work, for instance. Like, it just, I don't know. Even with my domain expertise, that I could make statements this strong and get away with it. So that's, Lars, when you said lots of domain expertise, yeah, I agree. Ambika says, in the math example, monotonicity means we have to demonstrate that parents stop taking drugs so children will have better outcomes in order to prove monotonicity. Yeah, it was a terrible example. So, but I think the point you're saying here, Ambika, is it's not you can't prove monotonicity. You have to assume monotonicity. I think that's a big thing for me here, right? Well, you use Julio's example because his example is much better with education. It sounds like you have to assume monotonicity, and then you can make this. Then you can estimate the local average treatment effects. I don't know if there's a way to prove monotonicity, and again, that's another struggle I have in this chapter. If we went to the applications and we talked about the lotteries, I don't know if it's proved that if you get Medicare, you're going to get better health outcomes for the local average treatment effects. I mean, it seems to me, again, that you have to assume that it does to end up making these causal claims. Because, again, I think the part that I struggle with this chapter is, like, the math is the math, right? You can get these numbers, and you can calculate them, whatever they'll be, but there's a lot of burden to make the causal claim, right? It's different than just estimating numbers. You have to meet all these criterias, as he says in the conclusion, to have a full causal claim. And it sounds like the monotonicity assumption is needed to make a causal claim when there's heterogeneous effects on the treated folks. Ambika, let me know if that helped as well. Hopefully my rough thoughts here are making things at least a little bit clearer. Chad says, doesn't the meth example show that you need two-stage least squares and not OLS? I came in on that portion of the discussion. Yeah, so Chad, this was the earlier part that Ambika had asked a question about. I wasn't sure why you need I'm like still a little struck on why you need two-stage least squares regression. I sort of get it, but I don't completely get why we can't just use one big linear regression and then just take out the value of Z, as the effects of A would already be controlled, I would think. So I honestly don't have much more to say here other than, like, I just don't. We saw two-stage least squares regression enough in this chapter, here and then also down here, like in a lot of places. Let me. Firefox is having a lot of trouble today. Let me pull that back up. So we saw two-stage least squares regression enough that we actually don't need that. Folks, let me switch to another screen. Let me set this up. So, yeah, it just two-stage least squares regression showed up enough times that I assume that you definitely need it. Like, it's needed for some reason, but I honestly still don't quite understand why. Let us switch to... And we're going to switch out of... All right, and we're back. Cool. You do have to demonstrate that instrument Z is not correlated with A while being highly correlated with S. Actually, you know what? I think you got it. Wow, that was quite easy. You did a great job explaining it to me. Okay, that actually explains it why. It's perfect. Oh, that makes so much sense. Okay, Chad, thank you. I get it now. I don't know why that did not click. That makes complete sense. That's why you can't do it in one regression. Great. Wow. That's why I'm glad we run this book club. Thank you so much. That was very, very helpful. Yeah, you folks both got it. So great. Oh, I'm really thrilled. Thank you so much. Okay, so as you can tell, that is as much as I was able to make out of this chapter. I'm gonna just completely leave it open to questions for the next. I mean, this group discussion has been great. So let's say for the next couple minutes, if you have any thoughts or anything, type them in, and let's just keep this discussion going. I'm curious to hear, are there any more questions, or specifically, what was the biggest takeaway for the folks here? And while you're doing that, I'm going to pull up the slides again on my new browser. So give me a sec. Okay, doesn't seem like we have a lot going on in the chat, so I am going to assume that we are so far good with instrumental variables. I want to say again, I did feel like, honestly, this was one of the weaker, not your guys' fault, but I did a weak job on this week explaining instrumental variables to you folks, and I apologize for that. But what I'm curious about, and I will start a thread in the discourse, is if we want to have another discussion in instrumental variables, and we want to maybe have a more group discussion format or async format discussion, let's certainly do that, because instrumental variables, I've seen this come up over and over again with things like weather using as an instrument or other things. So if there's more desire to dig into instrumental variables more, let me know, and we will do another session. Not one like this, but one that's more inclusive for discussion. So do let me know about that. As for what's next, we'll just move on to the next section. So we'll be doing panel data, and we'll do it in 3 weeks. The reason being, I'm traveling to the NumFocus Summit next week, so I'll be in Northern California instead of Southern California, and then the week after that, I'll still be a little bit busy. But let's go ahead and read the next chapter. It looks to be a little bit shorter, which will be nice, and I think panel data is a much more straightforward topic, so I'm actually quite excited for this as well. All right, and so with that, if there's any questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. Add those there. I will say the other thing while I'm waiting for questions is we are almost near the end of this book. I think within a couple months, we're going to be finished. There's only 2 chapters left, I think, after panel variables, and the conclusion I won't really count as a chapter. So if you like this format and you enjoyed it and you want to do more book clubs, I particularly enjoyed this a lot. Let me I'll post a thread in the general topic channel, and we can see what way we want to go with a future book club if you'd like to do one. If folks want to stick with a more theoretical book, and we want to do more conceptual stuff like causal inference, or whether we want to move towards, let's say, applied things like more like coding, Python, or things like that, or another topic entirely. So I just, on a broader perspective, let me know. And doesn't look like we have anything in the chat. So with that, thank you for this much shorter live stream today. Thanks for listening through instrumental variables. And in particular, thank you so much for helping me reach that understanding with two-stage linear regression. It just clicked on this book club, and I really appreciate it, because learning together, I think, is a lot more effective and a lot more fun than trying to read these chapters on our own. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate it, and we will see you in a couple of weeks here.